Throughout this course, I've encouraged you to be a good consumer of science. I've described many studies that suggest tips for helping our children with everything from reading to physical fitness. I've suggested that science-based reasoning is not only something you can do, it's something that you should do to guide your parenting style and your parenting decisions. Today, I want to suggest something more. Not only should you be a good consumer of science, you should be, at least with your own kids, a producer of science. You should be a collector of data, an analyzer of trends, a developer of theories. You should be a parent scientist. There's a lot of research out there, and a lot of it is really high-quality stuff. But as many different studies as there are, not everything has been the subject of experimentation. There are more questions than answers, and that's just not going to change anytime soon. In some cases, there just isn't any good published science on an issue that might really matter to you. In that case, you, dear parent, have to be your own scientist. And even if something has been studied in general, it typically hasn't been studied in your house, with your family and your kids. You can infer what's likely to work with your kids based on studies of other people, but that's not the same thing as having a study done with your own kids. There's situations in which you might have some doubts as to whether results obtained with a group of rural Minnesota kids, or perhaps a group of kids in New York City, whether those results will apply to your own particular situation. The published study might suggest how something might work, but if you have doubts about the differences between your kids and the ones in the study, you should probably keep track of things to see if your intuitions about what will work are correct. You should keep some record of your actions and the subsequent behaviors of your child to see if the desired outcomes are produced or not. In this course, we've talked about a lot of different experiments that researchers have run with children and their parents. Usually those studies are conducted under carefully designed and controlled laboratory conditions. Often they involve specialized equipment and software for conducting statistical analyses of the data that's collected. All of that said, you can try out many of these studies yourself, right in your own home. One of my favorite examples of this is a study you can try with infants between about 4 and 8 months of age. Around 4 months, most kids will develop the ability to reach out and pick up a small object with their hand. Usually this is immediately followed by picking up that object and putting it in their mouths, of course. While kids at this age can grasp an object, they aren't actually all that good at it. For instance, regardless of the shape and size of the object, babies will tend to spread their fingers all the way apart and reach with an overhand grip. Adults, and even slightly older children, say 9-month-olds, are much more precise than this. When we reach for a large object, we open our fingers wide. When we reach for a small object, we use a much smaller grip. If you ever reach for something, say a coffee cup, and stop yourself right before you touch that object, you'll notice that the configuration of your fingers very precisely matches the size, shape, and orientation of the target. This is all very automatic. We don't have to think about it at all. But there's some impressive mental processing that's happening every time you do something that feels so simple, just reaching out to pick something up. You can see some of this emerge by playing with your baby, handing her different objects in different orientations and watching how she reaches for them. A long, thin object, like a wooden spoon or a ruler, is good to use here. If you orient the object horizontally, your 4-month-old will make a very adult-looking reach for it, using that overhand grip. If you orient it vertically, however, the child will likely use that same overhand grip, and it won't work very well. If you play this game every few days for a while, say for a few months, you'll notice an important motor milestone, somewhere between 5 and 7 months of age. The child will start to orient the hand to match the target axis prior to making the reach. Within a few more weeks, this hand adjustment will take place in a very fluid manner. The hand will rotate during the reach itself. Even before the child can reach for things, you can watch your baby's smooth tracking system come online. When we move our eyes around to scan the room, we don't move them smoothly. In fact, we can't even do that if we try. If you look to your left and then try to pan smoothly to the right, with your eyes, you'll notice that they shift from place to place very abruptly in discrete jumps. These abrupt movements are called saccades. Under normal circumstances, we make about 3 of these saccadic eye movements every second that we're awake with our eyes open. The only time we don't move our eyes in this saccadic fashion is when we follow some moving target. If there's some object moving across our field of view, we can lock in on it and follow it very precisely. Our eyes stop moving in discrete jumps and smoothly track. Babies are able to control their eye movements from the moment they're born. As I've discussed already, they tend to look at things that they find interesting, things like human faces or bright novel objects. Newborn infants can make saccadic eye movements, but they can't make smooth tracking movements. The brain systems that coordinate that, located in the medial temporal cortex, just aren't developed enough yet. You can test this with any baby you happen to meet. Hold a bright, interesting object in front of an infant and get her to look at it. Jingling keys work really well here, but even just moving your fingers around can get an infant's attention. Once the infant has fixated that object, move it slowly from side to side. If the baby's younger than about 6 weeks of age, you'll see saccadic movements that will follow those keys, or whatever the target is, but will lag behind them. As with the reaching game, you can try this with a baby every few days, and notice that there's still no smooth tracking for a while, for several days, several weeks, depending on when you start. Sometime between 6 and 8 weeks of age, however, there'll be an abrupt shift. One day, you may see no hint of smooth tracking. On the next, the smooth tracking will be there. These are fun games to try with a baby. They let you clearly see the developing body and mind at work. You now know about these aspects of child development, but you'll be able to directly see them. You can be the scientist here. Today I'm going to urge you to consider being the scientist in a wide range of different contexts. To study humans from a scientific perspective, you have to make an important assumption about the similarity of people, one that not everyone's willing to make. In order for experimentation to work, you recruit some group of participants, the group of participants for your study, and then you perform some procedure. You assess something about that group of people. You analyze the results, and you report your findings. Then you assume that the patterns seen in those people who just happen to participate in your study will also apply to other groups of participants, both in the future and in other places. Let's think this through with a particular example from this course. There's a really good study demonstrating that giving kids experience with traditional Taekwondo improves their self-control and even their performance on math tests. The study was conducted with a large group of kids recruited from a Midwestern elementary school around 2003. The effects were consistent and statistically significant with that group of kids. How do I know that the same thing would work with your kids if you enrolled them in a different Taekwondo class today? The reasoning that you typically employ here is to presume that your child is, in terms of the things that mattered in this study, the same as those children. Your child has a human brain. Your child probably grew up in a situation that's relatively similar to that of the children in the study. Your child probably watches similar amounts of television and plays some of the same games. Your child speaks the same language as those children. Your child is similar to them in many ways. That said, there's still an assumption being made here. Every child's different, unique really. Indeed, one of the most important and enjoyable aspects of parenting is discovering the things that make your child a unique and special human. It would be silly to say that your child is the same as those children who took the Taekwondo classes in that study. Of course, that's not true. The question is whether those unique and different things about your child are important for the observed effects of Taekwondo on self-awareness, self-control, math achievement, and other factors that might matter to you. It might be that your child has especially good self-control already, or maybe especially bad self-control. Maybe you don't have access to one of those traditional Taekwondo classes described in that paper, but there's a Tai Chi class that seems like it might work as well. Would that work? Developmental scientists will sometimes sound even a bit excited if you ask that sort of thing. Will that work? Well, that's an empirical question. How would you run a mini experiment to see if those Tai Chi classes were effective with your child? Let's start with a simple experiment that has problems and then add features to tighten things up. So you could give your child a math test, then enroll him in the Tai Chi class, wait a few weeks, and then give the math test again. If the Tai Chi class works to improve math performance, then you should see performance in the second math test, right? Well, yes, but there's an obvious problem here. There are actually lots of reasons to expect improvements on the math test that don't have anything to do with Tai Chi. The child will be a few weeks older, for one thing. He'll likely have learned more math during the weeks that he was taking the Tai Chi class. And perhaps most importantly, he probably would have done better just because he'd seen the test before. What you need is some way to assess math performance that doesn't suffer from these test-retest problems. Depending on your particular situation, you might need to be creative here, but in the realm of math achievement, the child's school probably provides it for you. If your child is studying math at school, then he probably gets periodic tests. Every one of those tests is different and new. Some quizzes might be a little harder or easier than others, but probably not a lot. Particularly over time, you should expect that the grades on those tests will provide a reasonable indicator of how well your child is performing in terms of math achievement. So, you start by recording your child's math grades for a while, say 2 weeks. Then you enroll him in those Tai Chi classes and continue collecting that math performance data. If the Tai Chi classes help, then those math grades should improve. I should note that when I say record those math grades, I mean literally write them down. Human memory is an amazing thing, but we're notoriously bad in terms of being selective in our memory for things that match our expectations. If some of the tests don't match your predictions, for instance, your mind will be tempted to discount those as unusual outlier types of situations. I recommend having a notebook where you write these things down. To make it more visual, you can write the scores in a little homemade graph, maybe with dates across the bottom and how high the score was at each date. Or perhaps even use a spreadsheet on a computer. Putting the data into a computer also comes with the benefit of enabling you to easily calculate averages across the time periods in question. You can even graph them that way. That said, you can calculate averages by hand or with a basic calculator, so the computer isn't essential here at all. What is needed is the careful record keeping while you're running your mini experiment. So let's imagine you've run your experiment. You collected the math grades for several weeks and calculated an average. Then your child participated in Tai Chi classes for a month while continuing to study math and take those math quizzes. You collected those math grades as well and calculated another average. Let's be optimistic and say the grades improved across time, that the child has been studying Tai Chi and getting better math grades. Did the Tai Chi make the math grades improve? Well, maybe. This next part is where developmental science often diverges from a parent research project. From a developmental science perspective, you have some important alternative explanations for the changes that don't have anything to do with Tai Chi per se. The child got older and more mature during the time that you've been conducting your study. Maybe he would have improved at math just because of this. In a real-world experiment, you'd have a control group of kids who did not take Tai Chi to check for this, but you don't have that luxury here. It's also very likely that you talked with your child about this project. Indeed, you probably should talk to your child about it. You should let your child know that this activity has the potential to help him improve in terms of his self-control and his math performance, and that you'll be keeping track to see if it works. This is certainly the authoritative parenting way to go about this. It might be that Tai Chi isn't the best activity to pursue here, actually, if there's some alternative that your child would like to try instead, but also seems like it would fit the bill. In any event, it could be that your child, based on this information, this conversation with you and your encouragement, works harder at math. Perhaps he'd become more confident about math since he'll expect to accomplish more. If that's the case, then the math performance might improve with any activity. Again, it might not be the Tai Chi that really caused the improvement. In this case study type of situation that we're considering here, an experimenter might employ an A-B-A-B design. In a design like this, A corresponds to the baseline, the control condition. The letter B corresponds to the exposure to Tai Chi. So AB would involve collecting baseline math performance, then math performance with Tai Chi for a few weeks. Then you would stop the Tai Chi classes for a while, maybe a few weeks in this case. You'd expect that math performance would decline, or at least stop improving, at which point you would restart the Tai Chi participation and expect to see those math scores rise again. Actually, the time scale of the stops and starts might matter a lot as well. If the effects of Tai Chi are long-lasting, for instance, then your second A phase, when you stop the Tai Chi, might need to be many months long, perhaps even years, to notice an appreciable drop in math performance. A design like this would certainly provide you with more confidence in the effectiveness of the Tai Chi for promoting the math achievement. Depending on your situation, you might want to try that, but most parents look at the improving math scores and just leave well enough alone. If the goal is to improve math performance, then that's an end unto itself. Figuring out just why the math performance improved is perhaps interesting from a developmental science perspective, but figuring out whether the Tai Chi mattered isn't nearly important enough to sacrifice the child's math learning just to find out. It's easy, however, to think of how you could use techniques like this to assess any of the tips that I've described in this course. If you choose to reinforce reductions in sedentary activity to promote weight loss, you should keep a careful journal of your child's daily level of activity. You should keep a track of when reinforcements were delivered and, of course, changes in weight and body mass index. If your child seems depressed and you choose to get her involved in team sport activities to combat that negative mood, start a journal to keep track of her mood. Each day, ask her to rate how she feels each morning and evening. Say, on a scale from 1 to 10, where 1 is very depressed and 10 is very happy, how do you feel today? You should explain why you're doing this. You should make it clear that you don't want the child to just change the answers just to please you. Explain that you're concerned and wonder if playing on the tennis team will help. I should note for this self-rating of mood that you should make a point of asking for those ratings at the same time each day, perhaps right after waking up and right before bedtime. Our moods naturally fluctuate during the day, and your mini experiment will work much better if you can eliminate that spurious variability from your data. While you're at it, you should recruit your child to keep track of things as well. Not a Dear Diary type of journal here, but a record of the activities of the day. After a few weeks, go through that journal and look to see if your child's mood changes as a function of particular activities or even days of the week. You might notice that after the child watches TV for a long period of time, the next day she feels somewhat blah. A discovery like this can be really important. It gives you a hypothesis to test. Bring out your AB design and try out an intervention in which TV time is reduced and then increased and then reduced. In addition to dealing with the immediate problem, in this case the feeling sad, you'll be teaching your child how to systematically explore and regulate herself for the rest of her life. Whenever any problem like this arises, you'll be teaching her how to be a young scientist. I've personally used this type of technique since my daughter was an infant. She never liked going to sleep. She would get so tired, you could just see it in her eyes. Her head would nod, even bounce up and down. But she would fight to stay awake. She discovered very early that as long as she was moving around and making noise, that she could keep herself awake. My wife and I could walk her around, rock her gently to sleep, but eventually we'd need to set her down. And as soon as we did, she would wake up again. After a few weeks of this, we decided to try the Ferber method to help her learn to self-soothe and put herself to sleep in her crib. The Ferber method, remember, involves following a particular bedtime ritual. In our case, this was dinner, diaper, pajamas, a book, then a walk around the house, and that walk would end at the crib. We would gently place her in the crib, talk in soothing tones, say goodnight, turn out the light, and then leave the room. She cried, of course, at which point we would walk back in. We would calm her again, and then repeat the process, turn out the light and leave the room. With each repetition, we tried to stay out of the room a little bit longer. Now, my wife and I are science people, and to be honest, we found it very hard to listen to her cry, so we would actually time how long we would wait. 1 minute the first time, then 5 minutes, then 10 minutes, then 15. We'd try to wait longer than 15 minutes, but we never really made it much longer than that. On the first night, this process went on for more than an hour. She spent a very long time crying that night before she finally fell asleep. I presume she just collapsed from the exhaustion of the whole thing. The second night, she went to sleep in the first 5 minutes. We figured we had this thing solved. We thought, what a genius our daughter is. Then came the third night. It seemed just as tough as the first. The fourth night was maybe a little bit better. The fifth night seemed kind of like the first one again. That was the night I quietly crawled into the room and hid under her crib to listen and make sure she was actually okay while she was yelling and crying like this. At some point, we started taking notes on this and started keeping records of how much time we spent per evening. Any given set of 3 or 4 days looked like there was no improvement. But when we looked at our data after about 2 weeks, there was a clear downward trend. She was learning to self-soothe. We didn't keep careful records of her moods during the day, but I remember her becoming a much happier baby once she accomplished this task. When she would get tired, she would go to sleep. After she slept for a while, she'd wake up and just be much happier. Overall, this intervention was highly successful, both for our daughter and, frankly, for our family as a whole. Is this something that I would be able to write up as an article and submit to a journal somewhere? Of course not. It's only about one child. That said, she was the only child I was interested in helping at this moment. But by keeping careful records of our actions and her behaviors, I was able to see patterns in her behavior that were, across any short period of time, just not apparent. You can do the same with your children. As your children get older, they can participate in the process. Throughout this course, I've described parenting and child development tips that are supported by scientific research. In many cases, I've described particular experiments in order to provide illustrations of how the research is actually performed. But with rare exceptions that I've noted, those examples are backed up by other studies, in many cases, many other studies, that have produced similar results. One of the things that I've argued for is that science can and should be used to make decisions about parenting and child development. There are many other sources of information that are not based on science. And not all of them are necessarily bad, but they aren't necessarily good either. Lots and lots of people will be willing to tell you stories about their kids and give you parenting advice based on those stories. Actually, I just did that a moment ago. Many of these people might sound very confident, and we humans have an inherent tendency to assume that information that is conveyed confidently tends to be true. You may find yourself convinced that these suggestions are good things to try. Making parenting decisions based on the stories of others is called reasoning by anecdote. And it's not much better than simply reasoning by guessing. I'll reinforce that point using the example of a surprisingly common belief, an incorrect belief, that some vaccinations increase the likelihood of developing autism. If you reason based on scientific evidence, it's very clear that vaccinations are the right way to go. If you happen to listen to the stories told by very confident parents who hold this erroneous belief about vaccination and autism, you might make the wrong decision. Let's start with a consideration of vaccinations for measles, mumps, and rubella. Systematic vaccination has rendered these diseases virtually extinct in modern developed countries. But the viruses live on in other parts of the world. As people travel around the globe, the organisms periodically get carried around with them, and people are exposed to them. You might have been exposed to measles today, but you'd never know it because you're immune to it. You've been vaccinated. If you hadn't been vaccinated, you'd be in for serious problems. If you were an unvaccinated child who was exposed, the situation would be even worse. Measles in particular can have long-term health consequences, including lifelong brain damage, deafness, even death. A few injections of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, often called the MMR, you can be essentially guaranteed not to have any of this. It seems like a no-brainer. There's a persistent belief, however, promoted by a committed group of parents, that the MMR vaccine can cause autism. The belief comes from straightforward reasoning by anecdote. In the United Kingdom, MMR vaccination rates have fallen, in no small part due to concerns about vaccination and autism. Over the past decade, it's become increasingly routine to see outbreaks of the measles each year that affect 1,000 children or more. Most of these thousands of children recover, but some don't. Some bear the lasting damages of the illness. Some die. And this isn't just in the United Kingdom. In 2011, in the United States, 222 cases of the measles were reported. This according to the Centers for Disease Control. This is the most in 15 years. In the first 8 months of 2013 alone, there were 8 separate outbreaks of measles reported, again, based on data from the CDC. Now, if all but one child were vaccinated, that wouldn't likely be a problem, unless that one particular child came into contact with the very rare measles virus. There'd be no consequences at all. If all but 1% were immunized, the math works out about the same. Exposure to measles, for instance, is very unlikely in general. Even if 1% of the kids out there have the potential for carrying and further spreading the illness, then the likelihood of an outbreak remains relatively small. If a large enough percentage of children are not immunized for measles, however, say 15%, the situation becomes like a powder keg. If any of those 15% are ever exposed to measles, then there's an environment in which the disease can spread very quickly and do great damage. I don't think there's anything more tragic and awful than the death of a child, except perhaps the death of a child that could have been prevented with a simple, inexpensive vaccination. And the root of the problem goes beyond viruses and vaccines. The root of this problem, the heart of it, is this reasoning by anecdote. Scientific, evidence-based reasoning isn't just a choice, it's the right choice. Why do parents refuse the vaccine for their children? There are at least 3 reasons. 1, a paper published in 1998 in a respected medical journal called The Lancet suggested the link. The paper was quickly refuted on many different grounds, and in 2010 the paper itself was retracted by the journal because of evidence that the original data were largely fabricated by its author. But the original reference is still quoted, and some people still give that a certain amount of credence. Long after the initial scientific refutations began to appear, the paper was still cited from time to time by misinformed journalists. 2, the primary symptoms of autism spectrum disorder don't show up until shortly after the age that the MMR shot is typically given. This unfortunate coincidence leads many to believe that the shot caused those symptoms. 3rd, many people find the reasoning by anecdote evidence compelling, more compelling than the logic-based reasoning based on careful experiments. Let's consider these 3 things in turns. First, the published article. In the paper, Andrew Wakefield, the author, and his colleagues described studying 12 children who'd been diagnosed with autism. The paper reports analyses of a wide range of different types of tissue samples taken from those children. Ultimately, they argue that the stress of dealing with 3 different viruses at the same time, measles, mumps, and rubella, may overwhelm the immune system, setting in motion a cascade of physiological events that lead to developmental disorders of the central nervous system. This, according to the paper, is what can lead to autism. This sounds alarming, but the data don't support those conclusions. Let's consider what was wrong with this study. Wakefield studied children who were already diagnosed with autism, and not very many of them. While we're on the subject, it was just 12 kids. These children had received the MMR vaccination. Wakefield claimed he observed reactions to that vaccination, but this doesn't tell us anything about how vaccination affects typically developing children at all. In order to make that determination, you need a large group of kids, some of whom are vaccinated with MMR, and some of whom are not. Among the MMR vaccinated group, is there a greater incidence of autism? I mentioned that the Wakefield paper received a lot of media attention after it was published. It also received a lot of scientific attention. This exact study, the one that actually addresses the issue, has been done many times. At least 14 large-scale studies conducted on 3 different continents involving thousands of participants have sought to characterize the connection here. The same results have been produced over and over. There is no significant link between vaccination and likelihood of autism. That said, if you Google the terms "vaccination causes autism," you'll get an enormous number of hits. Jenny McCarthy, Jim Carrey, and several other celebrity actors have even become spokespeople for this connection. You can find stories about children who were developing along a completely normal trajectory until the MMR shot was given. After the vaccination, strange behavioral symptoms began to emerge, symptoms associated with autism. Within a few months, a diagnosis of autism was made. Autism is a complex disorder, but one of the most central aspects of it are disruptions in children's ability to engage in social and communicative activities. Until around 9 months of age, even non-autistic kids are pretty limited in their ability to reason about social interaction and communication. It's only when you get to 12 months and beyond, when there's a dramatic improvement in typically developing kids, that anyone can tell that there's a problem with an autistic child's behavior. And due to essentially an accident of history, that same 12-month age is the time when it's most appropriate to administer the MMR vaccination. Imagine for a moment that you're the parent of a baby. Your child seems absolutely fine up through 12 months of age. You visit the pediatrician and the child receives the MMR vaccination. As the immune system responds to a vaccine, it's completely normal to have muscle aches and a mild fever. So in the days after the MMR vaccination, maybe your child seems to get sick. And then in the weeks and months after, you suddenly start to notice the symptoms of autism. It's kind of hard to blame the parents in this situation. Exhaustive research has shown us that the link isn't there, but it's easy to imagine how a parent would perceive it as real. It's hard to blame the parents in this situation, but it's also hard to escape the fact that their conclusion is just wrong. Exhaustive research has shown us that autism is not caused by vaccinations. For the moment, measles remains very rare, such that not vaccinating a child is unlikely to have serious consequences. But as the rate of vaccination refusals has risen in recent years, the likelihood of devastating outbreaks, indeed the frequency of those outbreaks, has continued to rise. This crystal clear result gives parents all the information they need to make a decision about MMR vaccination. There's no evidence of long-term complications associated with it. And there's a high risk from avoiding the vaccination. You should have your children vaccinated. Science is really clear on this one. While the rates of vaccination have dropped in many countries, they remain relatively high. So it's likely that you already agreed with this tip. That said, I hope it provides you with some certainty about it. I hope it will, in a sense, immunize you against the potential persuasion of a group of parents who are convinced that you shouldn't vaccinate your kids. Perhaps more important, however, I hope that the story provides you with a framework to have in mind when you evaluate anecdotal stories from others. Stories can provide great ideas for things to try with your kids. And some of those things you try might work, either to solve a problem you're having or maybe providing some new activity to try. But you must resist the pull of a compelling, confident story. Trust your scientific reasoning. Trust the data. Data doesn't always have a lot of personality, but it's almost always really trustworthy. When you keep records of your child's development, in a sense, you're being a developmental scientist, one who's focused on one particular child. Here I've described ways you can use those records to assess the benefits of activities and interventions for your child. But those journals, however simple, can have a value all by themselves. That's particularly true when you review them after months or years have passed. They're useful for making decisions about how to parent, but they can be wonderful for enriching how you experience your child's life.